Welcome to ICU Fellowship Prepcast.
Hi, I'm Maddie.
Hi, I'm Swapnil. And today we're back with another 3 sets of Vivas. So, Maddie, great week to be in New South Wales.
Yeah.
Lockdown is finally open.
Yeah. I know people were apparently lining up outside Kmart at midnight. I don't know what's so urgent to get at Kmart at that time.
Look, I think it just people are so fed up. And I think the most important line was outside the barber shop. Everybody wants to.
Yeah.
And anyways, the fellowship exams are just around the corner. So all the best to all the candidates who are preparing for the exam.
Good luck.
Let's dive into today's episode. So, Maddie, the first scenario is you are the intensivist in charge of a 12-bed regional ICU. A 50-year-old female presents 5 months after heart transplant for dilated cardiomyopathy. Now, she has been short of breath for several days, and she has a temperature of 37.8 degrees Celsius. When you attach the monitoring, you notice that she got atrial fibrillation with a ventricular rate of 126 beats per minute. Her blood pressure is 80 over 50 millimeters of mercury, and her SATs on room air are 88%. And her GCS is recorded to be 15. Her current medications include tacrolimus, mycophenolate, and prednisone. So, can you tell us what are the 2 most important causes of this presentation to consider? And then how would you distinguish between 2 of them?
So the 2 most important causes of this presentation would be infection in an immunosuppressed patient or transplant rejection. Distinguishing between these 2 differentials would involve a thorough assessment, including history, examination, and investigations. So on history, the important aspects to distinguish between infection and rejection would involve exploring the presenting symptoms and the risk factors for each. So for presenting symptoms for infection, it'd be important to identify any localizing symptoms of infection, although keeping in mind that they may be non-specific or atypical due to her immunosuppression, but such symptoms might include fevers, cough, sore throat, rhinorrhea, nausea, vomiting or diarrhea, dysuria, headache or night sweats. For rejection, the symptoms of rejection are generally those of heart failure. So they can involve shortness of breath, orthopnea, paroxysmal nocturnal dyspnea, presyncope, palpitations, fatigue, decreased exercise tolerance, anorexia and weight gain. And she might have gastrointestinal symptoms secondary to hepatic congestion, which would involve things like nausea and abdominal pain. Thinking about the risk factors, for infection, the highest risk to opportunistic infections are in the 1 to 6 months post-transplant, which she is in. And important factors to consider are her net state of immunosuppression, epidemiological exposure, the potential for nosocomial exposure, and any latent infections that she might have that might be reactivated. So in terms of net state of immunosuppression, this would involve looking at whether she'd been compliant with any antimicrobial prophylaxis, the type, dose, and duration of immunosuppressants that she's on, her nutritional status and exercise, any previous vaccinations she'd had, including influenza, Hep B, and pneumococcal, the presence of any invasive devices, and any comorbidities that might impact on her immunosuppressive state, such as diabetes or coronary artery disease, which is more common post-transplant. Epidemiological exposure would involve travel or residence in areas of the world with unique endemic infections, such as exposure to TB, strongyloides, or HIV, any unwell contacts, and any exposure to things like contaminated food or water, soil, or animals. Nosocomial exposure would involve recent prolonged hospitalizations or use of broad-spectrum antimicrobials. And latent infections would involve thinking about the CMV status of the patient and the donor. The highest risk of a CMV infection is if it was a seronegative patient and a seropositive donor, and any TB or strongyloides. Thinking about rejection, important aspects would be the timing. So the risk is greatest during the first 6 months of post-transplant, which she's in, whether there were more HLA mismatches between the recipient and the donor, her compliance with immunosuppressive regimes and follow-up appointments, and any evidence of rejection. So in heart transplants, sometimes surveillance biopsies have done regularly. Looking at the examination, for infection, we'd look at localizing signs of infection, such as meningism or bronchial breath sounds, or anything that would increase the risk of infection, such as her nutritional status, whether she's malnourished, and her dental health. And looking for signs of rejection would involve looking for signs of heart failure, arrhythmias, which she does have. AF is one of the common signs that can be present in rejection, and things like raised JVP, peripheral edema, or bioacrep. Then coming to the investigations, we can divide these into bedside bloods and imaging. So for bedside tests for infection would involve things like a urinalysis as part of a septic screen, an ABG to look at the lactate, an ECG, and a sputum MCS. Whereas for rejection, you might do an echo looking at systolic and diastolic dysfunction, and ECG to look at any signs of ischemia. For blood tests for infection would involve peripheral cultures and paired vascular access cultures if she does have central access, and look at the organ function as a whole, so renal function, LFTs, coags, and a full blood count. Whereas for rejection, we might look at things like a troponin. Other blood tests for infection would be more specific for certain types of diseases. So we might do a quantitative PCR for CMV, EBV antibodies and DNA, HIV, Hep B and C antibodies, and might do a serum galactomannan and look at inflammatory markers such as procalcitonin. And imaging would involve looking at a chest X-ray and considering a CT, sometimes a CT pan scan, depending on your level of suspicion for infection. Other tests that might be done for infection would be other parts of a septic screen, such as stool, MCS if there's diarrhea, bronchoscopy and lavage if there's suspicion of a respiratory tract infection, and considering things like an LP or cryptococcal antigen if there's CNS signs. And the gold standard for rejection is a cardiac biopsy, which would show a mononuclear inflammatory response with myocyte damage, but this would involve being done in a transplant unit, which is not the current setting that we're in.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why the setting is really important in this context, because you presented a quite comprehensive list of investigations, which some of them might not be possible in the setting that we are currently in. So what are the kind of important principles of managing this patient in your regional ICU?
So the important principles are resuscitation, evaluation, and very importantly, early liaison and transfer to a transplant unit, specific management and supportive management. So in terms of resuscitation, this would involve supplemental oxygen, giving her sats at 88% on room air, full monitoring, large bore IV access, probably an arterial line and a catheter, and assessing her fluid status with cautious fluid boluses and early vasopressors, aiming for a MAP of 65 or more. Generally, we'd use broad spectrum antimicrobials, and this would be individualized depending on her history, but we can use something like Taz and Vanc, but might add antifungals depending on our level of suspicion. Evaluation would be what we've just outlined above, involving history exam and investigations, and thinking about other potential differentials such as PE, side effects of her immunosuppressants or a malignancy. And most importantly, it's early liaison and transfer to a transplant unit. So this would involve discussion of immunosuppressive regime and how to manage it. If it's a low risk of rejection, then sometimes mycophenolate is seized and prednisone is changed to hydrochlor at an increased dose. But it's important to get more specialised expertise from a transplant centre. Specific management would depend on the cause of the deterioration, which would involve source control and targeted antimicrobials if it is infection. But specific management of rejection will involve transfer to a specialised unit, and this generally involves high-dose steroids, changes or increased doses of immunosuppressants. And if it's an acute antibody-mediated rejection, plasmapheresis, IVIG or monoclonal antibody treatment. And then there's supportive management, which would involve things we do for most ICU patients, so optimising her organ function, aiming adequate SATs, adequate MAP, considering cardiac output monitoring, and monitoring for drug toxicities and interactions, especially considering the immunosuppressants she's on. It's important also to consider that the transplanted heart has no autonomic innervation, so agents such as digoxin and atropine won't have any effect. So we generally use direct acting agents such as noradrenaline, isoprenaline or adrenaline. And thinking about her nutrition, her PPI, and providing regular updates to the patient and her family.
Thanks, Maddie. So that's again a very comprehensive answer. And as you highlighted, it's very important to contact Cardiac Transplant Center as soon as possible, because they will be able to help you in selecting the drugs or giving some important advice, and also creating the bed capacity for this patient as soon as possible. So yes, for 12 to 24 hours managing in the regional ICU is not a bad idea if there are no beds available, but at the same time, it's very important to manage this patient in consultation with transplant center.
Yeah, the important thing that people always tell me before the exams, they don't put any extraneous kind of information in the stem. So to think about all parts of the stem when you're answering.
Absolutely. In real exam, the examiner might show you chest X-ray and ask for differentials, or it might give you the actually culture results and then organisms like Enterobacter cloacae or something. And then from there, the Viva might go on antimicrobials and how do you manage. and also the blood pressure management scenario, as you discussed, which agents will you use in this patient. So from here, the Viva can branch out in many directions, but I guess your role is to give a very comprehensive answer to the first opening question. Okay, so let's move on to the second scenario. You got 25-year-old male with isolated traumatic brain injury who has had a percutaneous tracheostomy inserted within the last 30 minutes to facilitate ventilatory weaning. The bedside nurse is concerned about the bleeding from the tracheostomy tube. When you look at the OPS, the monitor shows SATs of 88% on FiO2 of 80%, and this has increased in last half an hour from 40%. Currently, he is ventilated with SIMV volume control mode with a tidal volume of 400 mils, PEEP of 5 centimeter of water, normal peak and plateau pressure. His heart rate is around 120 beats per minute, and the blood pressure is around 180 over 110 millimeters of mercury. He is currently sedated and paralyzed. So, Maddie, can you please discuss your initial approach to the management of this patient?
This is a potentially life-threatening situation which requires urgent simultaneous resuscitation and assessment. I'd want to call for further assistance, confirm the tracheostomy is in the correct place, optimise his oxygenation and circulatory status, and assess for and treat the cause and contributors of his deterioration. So first, to call for help, as I'm likely to need more assistance to optimally manage this patient. This will initially be from the rest of the ICU team, but with consideration of anaesthetics or ENT if there are major concerns about the airway. And I'd be getting the airway and the arrest trolley outside this patient's room and allocating one person to review the file if I'm not familiar with the detail. And important aspects would be the grade of airway, any difficulties with insertion of the tracheostomy, previous ventilator settings, allergies, any anticoagulants or any recent coagulopathy, and any previous bleeding from the ETT. My priority first is to increase the FiO2 to 100% and ensure the tracheostomy is in the correct place. This would involve a quick assessment as to whether the EtCO2 trace is present and the trace looks normal, whether a suction catheter can pass easily, and if there are any clots present. And as the tracheostomy was just inserted, the bronchoscope should be readily available, and I can insert that down the tracheostomy and see if it is correctly positioned and whether there's any significant bleeding. If the tracheostomy is dislodged, then I'd remove it, cover the site, pre-oxygenate orally, and then intubate orally. But if the airway is in place, I'd disconnect it from the ventilator and see if he's easy to bag and there's equal chest rise, looking for any signs of abnormalities, subcut emphysema, or any atypical chest wall findings. If he bags easily when disconnected and the SATs improve, then it's likely to be a tubing or ventilator issue. So I'd look at the circuit and change the ventilator. If the bagging is more difficult and SATs aren't improving, there's multiple potential causes. So this would involve a thorough assessment of the breath sounds, chest movement, the amount of bleeding, whether he's adequately sedated and paralysed, and looking for any signs of an allergic reaction. I'd also be obtaining an urgent chest X-ray and ABG at this point. And then the management would depend on the cause of his deterioration. So if it's obviously something like a pneumothorax, this would involve decompressing. If it's bronchospasm or an allergic reaction, it'd involve adrenaline, steroids, and bronchodilators. It might be that he's just had atelectasis and derecruited. So this would involve an increased PEEP and increased tidal volume. If there's blood clots that are blocking part of the airway, I could assess that with bronchoscopy and potentially suction part of that out. And if it's dysynchrony, I'd increase the sedation paralysis. At the same time, I'd be assessing the circulation and optimising it, so making sure he had adequate IV access, an ABG group and hold, coags and a rotum if that's available, aiming to correct any medical cause of coagulopathy. I'd also be assessing the site of bleeding. There's multiple potential sites. It could be from around the tracheostomy itself, which is common after it's just been inserted. It could be from the nose or the mouth or from the lungs itself. I'd be assessing whether there was any pulsatility, which would make me more concerned for a tracheonominate fistula. If there was significant bleeding, I'd be doing 100% FiO2 via the tracheostomy and the face mask, giving nebulized tranexamic acid, and making sure there's IV access, MTP, and correcting any medical coagulopathy, and optimizing the tracheostomy tube position, inflating the balloon to its maximum volume, and obtaining urgent ENT assistance or angiography, depending on the level of stability of the patient.
Yeah, that's correct. Thanks, Maddie. So tracheostomy emergencies, again, it's a very fairly common question. And often in the real life, it's not that people don't know how to manage it, but often the errors occur due to poor crew resource management and miscommunication. So I guess getting the team ready, making sure that everybody has got a clear role allocation and everybody's on the same page in regards to what's the next action needs to happen. That's very important. And also in terms of the help, it's often you need a senior help rather than a registrar from the other specialties. So it just is some simple principles. But again, this scenario is not uncommon in the clinical practice. So make sure that you are aware of all the potential differentials and actions needed to take depending upon the scenario. You mentioned about tracheoinnominate fistula, which can be very scary. So what are the risk factors for this tracheoinnominate fistula?
So tracheoinnominate fistula is a life-threatening complication of a tracheostomy. It's an abnormal connection between the trachea and the innominate artery. The risk factors are anatomical risk factors or anything that increases the friability of the tissue. So in terms of anatomical risk factors, the innominate artery usually traverses the trachea between the 6th to the 9th cartilage ring. So there's an increased risk of fistula formation if this distance is reduced. So risk factors for this would be a tracheostomy that's performed below the 3rd tracheal ring, any hyperextension of the neck, anomalous or high location of the innominate artery, any neck or chest deformity, or pediatric patients. And then there are things that increase the friability of the tissue. So these would involve having a high pressure cuff on the tracheostomy, prolonged tracheostomy duration, excessive dissection of the tissues for the tracheostomy, prolonged use of steroids or immunosuppressants, any localized infection or radiotherapy, malnutrition, or recurrent episodes of hypotension.
Okay, and what are the clinical features of tracheoinnominate fistula?
So a sentinel bleed occurs in about 50% of patients. This is often minor and may be pulsatile and occurs before the massive bleeding. The timing is often greater than 48 hours since tracheostomy insertion, but can occur earlier or later. Initially, there can be blood-stained secretions, there can be massive hemoptysis or hemorrhagic shock. On bronchoscopy, there may be direct visualization of active bleeding from the anterior wall of the trachea around the 6th or 7th tracheal rings. And on angiography or CTA, there might be blush from the innominate artery into the trachea, but they're often not stable enough to undergo this.
That's correct. It can be really, really scary. And I've seen 2 of them in my life and both patients unfortunately died. So it's very scary to actually witness and manage this. So that's kind of leads nicely into the next question. How do you manage tracheoinnominate fistula?
So as you were saying, this is a life-threatening situation. It's important to call for senior assistance, which would include ENT or cardiothoracics, depending on your location. There'd be general resuscitation, which would involve activating an MTP, ensuring large bore IV access, 100% oxygen provided by the face mask and the tracheostomy, an airway trolley and a rest trolley in case the patient requires oral intubation, and correcting any medical contributors to coagulopathy and ensuring adequate sedation, paralysis and hemodynamic support. The specific management aims to compress the innominate artery. So initially this can involve overinflating the tracheostomy cuff and trying to position the tracheostomy cuff over the bleeding point with bronchoscopy. This isn't often possible as the tracheostomy might be too short. So then the next step is to replace the tracheostomy with an ET tube and place the cuff over the bleeding point. If this is unable to compress it, then the next step is to place the endotracheal tube distal to the bleeding site and use something called Lee maneuver, where a finger is placed through the tracheostomy opening and digital pressure applied on the artery and trying to compress it against the posterior sternum. And then definitive management can involve endovascular stenting or surgical ligation.
I guess it's important to be aware of these steps, but in real life, practicing those steps can be extremely challenging. But it's a good viva, and thanks, Maddie, for covering the important topic. Now, let's move on to our third scenario. It's a 60-year-old male who has been trampled by a bull. He has a history of right-sided pneumonia complicated by empyema 10 years ago, but is otherwise well and got independent ADLs. Now, when you perform the CT scan, that shows a significant right-sided hemopneumothorax, but nil other injuries. His OBS include respiratory rate of 30 per minute, SATs of 94% on 15 liters non-rebreather mass. His heart rate is around 100 beats per minute and blood pressure is 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury. So what technique would you use to decompress this patient's chest and why?
So I would use a formal intercostal catheter, as a pigtail drain is more likely to be blocked with blood from the hemothorax, and the patient, given his previous empyema, may have an unusual anatomy, and it might be potentially complicated or loculated given his previous empyema. So it's important to have a good look at the CT scan, see if there's any chronic pathology present, and discuss with cardiothoracics or surgeons if it is thought to be complicated. In terms of the technique, this involves preparing the patient, the staff, equipment, the insertion itself. In terms of preparing the patient, it involving explaining the procedure, obtaining consent, and getting full monitoring in a resuscitation kind of bay, which would involve SATs, ECG, blood pressure, either invasive or cuff cycling, depending on his stability, oxygen and tidal CO2 detector, and ensure that there's no coagulopathy and no allergies. And then look at his fasting status, ensuring there's adequate IV access in a group and hold, and positioning him adequately with a 30-degree head up, his arm abducted and elbow flexed, and his hand behind his head. It's important to prepare the staff, so I'd need someone competent in airway management and provide the sedation and potentially airway manoeuvres depending on how he goes. So either competent registrar or anaesthetics to provide this, and then prepare the equipment. So this would involve the drugs and emergency drugs. So drugs for both sedation and for intubation or hypotension if it happens, a pump set, vasopressors and fluids, the airway trolley with a bag valve mask, any airway adjuncts, suction and ET tube and end-tidal CO2, and all the equipment ready for a chest drain. Some places have a chest drain kit, and which just involves a sterile field, drapes, claw heck, the scalpel, curved forceps and a drain and suture material, and the underwater seal drain itself and a dressing. So insertion involves giving sedation and analgesia in small doses. So this might involve small doses of fenton-midaz, or some people use ketamine, and having full aseptic technique with gown, glove and sterile drapes with claw hex prepped. The triangle of safety is often used, which is anterior to the mid-axillary line, posterior to the pectoral groove and above the fifth intercostal space, and this is on the right. Then lignocaine infiltrated 1% to the skin and subcut tissue above the rib, infiltrated down to the parietal pleura and aspirating as you go. And there should be some blood once in the pleural space. An incision is then performed over the lines of the rib with scalpel, and this incision is about 1 to 2 centimetres long. And then there's blunt dissection with finger or blunt forceps. Once the parietal pleura is breached, there should be a rush of blood. This is then dilated with a finger, and the chest drain is loaded onto curved forceps oriented towards the apex of the lungs, and then the forceps used to allow the drain to follow the track. Once all the holes are inserted of the drain, the forceps are removed and the drain is sutured in place and dressed and connected to an underwater seal drain. And then there's a chest x-ray to confirm position. It's then also important to keep the patient monitored, as often the post-sedation and post-procedure time is the time that they can deteriorate from the anaesthetic or from the sedation that's provided.
Yeah, no, that's great, Maddie. So obviously, only one thing probably I will add there is so make sure that the group and cross match is ready, given that you might drain a lot of blood, and in that case, patient might become hypotensive and hypovolemic. In real life, you will refer these patients to CT-guided drainage just because of the previous history of complicated empyema, and sometimes these patients end up in getting loculated collections. But I guess examiners are trying to here gauge your knowledge of insertion of ICC and how you perform this procedure in your ICU. So in regards to intercostal catheters, what are the complications?
The complications can be divided into anaesthetic complications, complications from insertion, and complications from ongoing use. Anaesthetic complications include allergic reactions, aspiration, hypoxia or hypotension. Insertion complications include pain, damage to surrounding structures, which might cause things like a pneumothorax and injury to the lungs or liver or mediastinum or diaphragm, or significant vascular injuries with bleeding and hemothorax. It can be malpositioned, too shallow, making it subcutaneous, or too far into the mediastinum, or can go into the wrong structure, and it can be complicated by surgical emphysema. Complications of use include tube blockage or displacement, dislodgement, which can result in a tension pneumothorax. It can be infection, pain causing poor respiratory effort, which might cause atelectasis, hypoxia or pneumonias, and re-expansion pulmonary edema in the situation when they're used to drain large volumes of pleural effusion.
Great. Thanks, Maddie. So that's the end of our 3 Vivas, and we're coming into the last section of the podcast, which is Maddie's favorite section. So Maddie, do you have any joke for us today?
Yeah, always. Why does tacrolimus make the best dating coach?
Oh, I think this one is probably this is the only one which I can answer, I guess. It has to do something with the transplant and rejection. So I'm just going to say this is anti-rejection medicine.
Yeah,
So
pretty close. Because he helps your heart to avoid rejection.
Yes. This is my first, in last 2.5 years, I've managed to answer first Maddie's question. Well done. I can be very happy.
Well done, you.
That's right. I'm so happy. Thanks, folks. So thanks for listening. And we'll be back in months' time with another set of 3 Vivads. And if you feel that this podcast will be helpful to your colleagues, make sure that you pass on the web address www.critcareedu.com.au, or you can guide them to iTunes, Spotify, or Stitcher. So we'll see you in 1 month's time. Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.